I'm standing there, in a dress that cost more than my first car, clutching a bouquet so tight the stems are bruising my palms. The air in the ballroom is thick with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive perfume. But all I can smell is the cold, sharp scent of rejection. I look at the front row. The family of the groom section is a sea of silk and smug smiles. My husband's mother, Eleanor Montgomery-Vane, is adjusted her fascinator like it's a crown. But my eyes drift to the left, to the 4 empty gold chiffon chairs where my mother, my father, and my 2 younger brothers should be sitting. Instead, they're at the very back of the hall,
standing
behind a row of caterers. My father, a man who spent 40 years working the docks to put me through law school, is shifting his weight on his bad hip. My mother is clutching her worn handbag, her eyes downcast, trying to shrink into the wallpaper so she doesn't embarrass the new royalty we've married into. The officiant is droning on about 2 families becoming one, and I feel a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. One?
No.
This isn't a merger. This is a hostile takeover. Julian, I whisper, leaning toward my groom. His suit is bespoke, his hair is perfect, and his eyes are fixed straight ahead. Julian, look at the front row. Why are my parents standing at the back? He doesn't even turn his head. His jaw just tightens. Not now, Elena. We discussed the seating chart. My mother said the lighting was better for the professional photos if the more uniform guests were in the front. It's just aesthetics. Focus on the vows. Uniform. That was the word. A code for people who look like they belong in a country club. My parents, with their calloused hands and off-the-rack suits, didn't fit the Montgomery-Vane brand. I look back at my dad. He catches my eye. He gives me a tiny, shaky thumbs up, then quickly hides his hand when Eleanor glances back with a look of pure ice. That was the moment the first crack appeared in the floor of my fairy tale. I realized I wasn't being welcomed into a family. I was being curated. I looked at the microphone standing on the podium, just 3 feet away. It was meant for the readings. For the I-dose. But suddenly, the script I'd been following for the last 18 months felt like a lie written in someone else's handwriting. I felt my fingers loosen on the bouquet. I didn't want to marry a man who thought my father was an eyesore. But as the priest said, if anyone here has any reason why these 2 should not be wed.
I didn't wait for a guest to speak. I reached for the mic.
But then, Eleanor stood up. She didn't look at me. She looked at the crowd. Before we proceed, she said, her voice amplified by the lapel mic she was already wearing, I have a small announcement regarding the inheritance clause of the marriage contract. The room went deadly silent. Julian finally looked at me, but it wasn't with love. It was a warning. My hand was inches from the microphone when Eleanor's voice cut through the room like a piano wire. Inheritance clause? I whispered, the words tasting like copper. Julian, what is she talking about? Julian's grip on my hand went from supportive to restrictive. He squeezed my fingers hard enough to make me wince. It's a formality, Elena. We talked about the prenup. My mother just wants to ensure the estate stays within the bloodline. It's standard for families like mine. We talked about a prenup that protected your premarital assets. I hissed, my heart hammering against my ribs. We never talked about a clause that would be announced during our ceremony. And we certainly never talked about my family being treated like intruders. Eleanor wasn't finished. She stepped forward, gesturing to a man in a dark suit, their family lawyer, Miller, who appeared from the wings with a leather-bound folder. As the Montgomery-Vane legacy is one of tradition, Eleanor projected, her smile never reaching her cold, gray eyes, it is important that the bride acknowledges the suitability amendment. Since Elena's family cannot provide the reciprocal dowry of status, the marriage is contingent on a severance agreement. A severance agreement. At a wedding. I looked back at my parents. They looked confused, terrified. My mom started to move forward, but a security guard, one I didn't hire, one I didn't know, stepped into her path. What is this? I demanded, finally pulling my hand away from Julian. I didn't care about the 300 guests anymore. I didn't care about the $50,000 floral arrangements. Julian, tell me what this is. Julian sighed, a sound of genuine annoyance, as if I were being a difficult child. Elena, don't make a scene. It's just a document stating that your family won't have legal visitation rights to any future children without a supervised conduct review. My mother wants to make sure the kids are raised with certain standards. No dockyard influence. No lower-class habits. The world tilted. I felt the bile rise in my throat. I looked at the man I thought I loved, the man who had spent 3 years telling me that my working-class grit was what he loved most about me. It had all been a lie. I wasn't a partner. I was a project. I was a fresh blood, addition to a stagnating family tree, provided I was willing to cut off my own roots. You want me to sign away my parents? I asked. My voice was low, trembling. It's for the best, darling, Eleanor chimed in, walking toward us on the altar. She reached out to pat my cheek, her diamonds cold against my skin. Think of the life we are giving you. You'll never have to worry about money again. You'll be a Montgomery-Vane. Your parents, they'll be compensated for their loss. A nice retirement fund in exchange for their disappearance. It's quite generous. I looked at the lawyer. He held out a gold pen. I looked at Julian. He was waiting. He actually expected me to sign it. He thought his name was worth more than my father's soul. I took the pen. The room held its breath. I saw my mother's face go pale. I saw my father drop his head, defeated, thinking his daughter was about to sell him out for a title. I leaned into the microphone. I have something to say, I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was a blade. Julian smiled, thinking I was about to give a speech of gratitude. He leaned in to kiss my temple. I pushed him back. Not a gentle push. A shove that sent him stumbling into the priest. I think we need to talk about what's actually in this contract, I said, the speakers booming my voice to the very back of the hall. And we need to talk about where my family is sitting. But before I could say the next word, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open. The oak doors didn't just open. They groaned on their hinges as a woman in a clinical gray suit marched in, flanked by 2 men carrying heavy plastic crates. The guest list for this wedding was supposed to be the who's who of the city's elite, but this woman looked like she belonged in a courtroom or a morgue. Julian's face didn't just go pale. It went gray. A sickly, translucent gray that made his expensive tan look like a mask. Julian, I asked, the microphone still live in my hand. Who is that? He didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring at the woman as if she were a reaper. Eleanor, however, didn't lose her composure for a second. She stepped off the dais, her heels clicking like a firing squad on the marble floor. This is a private event, Eleanor hissed, her voice barely a whisper but magnified by the silence of the room. Security, remove these people. I wouldn't do that, Mrs. Montgomery-Vane, the woman in gray said. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. I'm Agent Sarah Miller from the Forensic Audit Division. And we aren't here for the cake. The room erupted. A low hum of whispers turned into a roar. I stood there, trapped between my groom and his mother, holding a microphone that was recording the sound of a dynasty collapsing. I looked at the crates. They weren't filled with wedding gifts. They were filled with files. Files with the Montgomery-Vane crest on them. Elena, honey. My dad's voice cut through the noise. He had walked up the side aisle, ignoring the security guards who were now too distracted to stop him. He reached the edge of the stage, his eyes searching mine. Elena, get away from them. Now. I looked at Julian. What is she talking about? Forensic audit? Julian, look at me. He finally turned. But the man looking at me wasn't the man I'd spent 3 years with. His eyes were hollow, filled with a desperate, animalistic fear. It's the firm, Elena. The expansion, we had to bridge the gap. My mother said it was handled. She said the investors were happy. Investors? I laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. You mean the charity you told me was your life's work? The Foundation for Underprivileged Youth. The woman in gray, Agent Miller, reached the front of the room. She looked at me with a flicker of genuine pity. The foundation doesn't exist, Mrs. Montgomery-Vane, or Miss Sterling, I should say, since the papers aren't signed. The money from that foundation didn't go to schools. It went to paying off the interest on your fiancé's gambling debts in Macau. I felt the floor drop. The $200,000 wedding. The $50,000 dress. The suitability amendment Eleanor wanted me to sign. It wasn't about status. It wasn't about my parents being lower class. It was about insulation. If I signed that contract, I wasn't just marrying Julian. I was legally becoming a shield for their assets. By signing that severance from my family, I was unknowingly agreeing to a financial structure that would make me, and only me, liable for the family debts if the audit went south. They weren't trying to keep my parents out of their circle. They were trying to make sure my parents didn't have any legal standing to sue when the Montgomery-Vanes dragged me into a federal prison cell with them. I looked at the gold pen in my hand. The pen Eleanor had pushed on me with such generosity. It felt like a hot coal. I looked at Eleanor. She wasn't looking at the agent. She was looking at me, her eyes narrowed into slits. "Sign the paper, Elena," she whispered, her voice a poisonous thread. "Sign it now, or I promise you, your father's little accident on the docks 10 years ago, the one that got him that nice disability pension? I'll make sure the insurance board hears the real story about how he tripped." My breath hitched. My father's pension was the only thing keeping my parents in their house. She wasn't just trying to use me. She was blackmailing me with my father's dignity. I looked at my dad, standing just 5 feet away. He heard her. I saw his shoulders slump. I saw the shame wash over his face, the shame of a secret he'd kept to survive, now being used as a weapon against his daughter. But then I saw something else. I saw him straighten his back. He looked at Eleanor, then at me. He shook his head. "Don't do it, Elle," he croaked. "Let them take the house. Don't you dare sign a thing for these monsters." Eleanor sneered. "Then say goodbye to your life, old man." I looked at the microphone. I looked at the 300 elite guests who were watching this like a reality show. Then I looked at the woman in gray. "Agent Miller?" I said, my voice booming through the speakers. "I'm a lawyer, and I'd like to offer you a piece of evidence that isn't in those crates." Julian tried to grab the mic, but I swung my heavy bouquet, the wire-wrap stems catching him across the jaw. He went down more from shock than force. "The inheritance clause," I said into the mic, holding up the document. "The one Eleanor just tried to force me to sign under threat of blackmail. It's not just a contract. It's a confession." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. Eleanor reached for the document, her manicured nails like talons, but I pulled it back. I wasn't the trembling bride anymore. I was a litigator in white lace. I had spent 7 years in law school and 3 years in the trenches of public defense. I knew exactly what I was holding. "This document," I said, my voice steady, professional, and loud enough to rattle the crystal chandeliers, references a sub-account 7 Bravo. It's listed here as the source for the retirement fund, offered to my parents in exchange for their silence. I turned to Agent Miller. "Does the name 7 Bravo appear in your audit of the foundation, Agent?" The agent's eyes lit up. A predatory smile touched her lips. "It does. It's the account we've been trying to trace for 6 months. It's the account where the Macau wire transfers originated." Eleanor's face didn't just crumble. It dissolved. The mask of the grand matriarch fell away, leaving behind a terrified, aging woman who had built her life on a foundation of sand and stolen dreams. "You little, ungrateful, gutterborn." Eleanor sputtered, her voice cracking. She lunged for me, but the 2 men with Agent Miller, who were clearly not just clerks, stepped in her way. "Mrs. Montgomery-Vane," one of them said, "you're going to want to stop talking. Every word you say is being recorded by the house audio system." I looked down at Julian. He was still on the floor, clutching his jaw, looking up at me with a mixture of hatred and pathetic pleading. "Elena, please. We can fix this. I love you. We can go away. We can take the money in the offshore account, and—" "The offshore account?" I interrupted, leaning the microphone toward him. "You mean the one you just admitted exists in front of a federal agent and 300 witnesses?" Julian's eyes went wide. He realized, too late, that his own arrogance was his undoing. He thought I was his prize, his possession, someone too dazzled by his wealth to see the wires behind the curtain. He forgot that I grew up watching my father read the fine print on union contracts. I was raised to spot a lie before it was even spoken. Turned away from him. The family of the Groom section was now a scene of chaos. Julian's cousins and aunts were trying to sneak out the side exits, but the doors were now guarded by more people in gray suits. The perfect wedding had turned into a sting operation. I walked to the edge of the stage. My dad was still there. He looked older, tired, but there was a light in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. "Dad," I said, the mic still on. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I ever let them make you feel like you didn't belong here. I'm sorry I almost believed their lies." My father reached up and took my hand. His grip was like iron. "You got nothing to be sorry for, El. You're Sterling. We might not have a coat of arms, but we got our names. And yours is still clean." I looked at the crowd. These people, the ones who had looked at my parents with disgust, the ones who had whispered about my simple background. They were all staring at me, some with horror, some with a sick kind of fascination. "For those of you who came for the open bar," I said, the bitterness finally leaking into my tone, "I suggest you drink up, because I have a feeling the Montgomery-Vane assets are about to be frozen. And for those of you who came to see a wedding," I reached behind my head, unpinning the 10-foot silk veil that had felt like a weight around my neck all morning. I let it fall to the floor in a heap of useless finery. "The wedding is cancelled. But the justice? That's just getting started." I stepped off the stage, walking past Julian, without a second glance. I headed straight for the back of the room, toward my mother and brothers. But as I passed Eleanor, she grabbed my arm. Her grip was desperate, her eyes wild. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her voice a low, jagged rasp. "You've destroyed my son. You've destroyed our name. But you're still nothing. You'll go back to your hovel, and I'll be out on bail by morning. I have friends, Elena. Friends who can erase people like you." I looked at her hand on my arm. Then I looked her dead in the eye. "Eleanor," I said, my voice calm and terrifyingly cold. "I'm a lawyer. You're a thief. In a room full of your friends, I'm the only one who knows how to read the law. And I've already sent a digital copy of that contract to the district attorney. Your friends aren't coming for you. They're busy deleting your number from their phones." I pulled my arm away, but as I reached my mother, a loud crack echoed through the hall. Not a gunshot. Not a gavel. It was the sound of the main doors being chained shut from the outside. The sound of the chains was heavy, final, and utterly wrong. Agent Miller spun around, her hand going to her belt. "Who is at those doors? We have federal jurisdiction here." But no one answered. The heavy oak doors, carved with the Montgomery-Vane family crest, didn't budge. Through the small glass panes at the top, I saw shadows moving. Not the shadows of police officers. These were men in tactical gear, but there were no badges. No insignias. The ballroom, once a place of celebration, suddenly felt like a tomb. "Julian." Eleanor's voice was high-pitched, teetering on the edge of a breakdown. "Julian, what is this? Who are those men?" Julian stood up slowly, wiping a smear of blood from his lip. The pathetic, whimpering man from a moment ago was gone. In his place was something colder. Something I hadn't seen in the 3 years we were together. He looked at his mother, then at me, then at the federal agents. "You thought it was just gambling debts, didn't you, Mother?" Julian said, his voice eerily calm. "You thought I was just a spoiled boy playing with cards in Macau." He stepped toward the center of the room, the guests backing away from him as if he were contagious. "The audit was inevitable," Julian continued, straightening his tuxedo jacket. "I knew that months ago. Why do you think I chose Elena? Why do you think I insisted on this specific date, this specific venue?" I felt a chill wash over me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I looked around the room. The venue was a historic manor, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woods. It was romantic and secluded. It was a fortress. "Julian," I said, my voice low. "What did you do?" "I made a deal, Elena," he said, looking at me with a distorted kind of pride. "But not with the people Mother knows. The people I owe money to, they don't care about legacy. They care about leverage. And in this room, we have the CEOs of 3 major banks, a Supreme Court justice, and 2 federal agents. The room descended into a different kind of panic. This wasn't a social scandal anymore. This was a hostage situation. "You sold us out," I whispered. "To cover your own skin, you're handing over your own guests?" "Not just the guests, Elena," Julian said, taking a step toward me. "The suitability amendment wasn't just about your parents' pension. It was a transfer of power. If you had signed it, the liability for the 7 Bravo account and the people it's connected to would have stayed with you and the foundation. But since you decided to be a hero," he gestured to the doors, "now the people I owe have to take their payment in influence. And they're going to start by making sure Agent Miller's crates never make it to the evidence locker." Agent Miller drew her weapon, but before she could level it, the lights in the ballroom flickered and died. In the sudden, oppressive darkness, the only sound was the frantic breathing of 300 people and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Elena," my dad yelled. I felt his hand grab mine in the dark. "Get down. Stay behind me." But I wasn't going to hide. Not again. I knew this building. I had spent weeks here planning the perfect day. I knew the service corridors, the wine cellar, and the old dumbwaiter system. I felt for the microphone. It was still in my hand, but the power was cut. It was useless.
Wait.
The power was cut to the lights. But the emergency backup for the fire alarm system, that was on a separate circuit. A circuit I had specifically asked the venue manager about when I was worried about the heavy catering equipment tripping a breaker. "Dad," I whispered, leaning close to his ear, "I need you to get Mom and the boys to the kitchen. There's a steel door that leads to the meat locker. It's reinforced. Lock yourselves in." "What about you?" As I moved, I heard Julian's voice in the dark. "Elena? I know you're there. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just give me the document, and I'll make sure your family gets out safely. I still love you in my own way." "You don't know the first thing about love, Julian," I whispered to the shadows. I reached the panel. My fingers found the glass. I didn't hesitate. I smashed it with the base of the heavy microphone. The alarm didn't just beep. It screamed. A piercing, 120 decibel siren that ripped through the silence, accompanied by blinding strobe lights that turned the ballroom into a chaotic, flickering nightmare. In the flashes of light, I saw the men in tactical gear breaching the side windows. But they were disoriented by the strobes. I saw Julian covering his ears, his face contorted in rage. And then I saw it, on the floor, near the altar, the gold pen. I didn't need a document. I needed a weapon. And as I lunged for the pen, I saw the shadow of someone standing right over it. It wasn't Julian. It was Eleanor. And she had a silver cake knife in her hand. The strobe lights turned the ballroom into a fragmented nightmare. In one flash, Eleanor was a regal statue. In the next, she was a banshee with a silver blade. The cake knife wasn't sharp enough to kill instantly, but in the hands of a woman who had just watched her empire turn to ash, it was lethal enough. "You ruined everything," she shrieked over the wail of the fire alarm. I didn't back away. The adrenaline was a cold fire in my veins. I remembered every time she'd looked at my mother's shoes with pity. Every time she'd corrected my grammar in front of her high society friends. Every suggestion she'd made to make me more suitable. "I didn't ruin it, Eleanor," I yelled back, dodging a clumsy swipe of the knife. "I just turned the lights on. You were the one dancing in the dark." I lunged for her wrist. My hands, strengthened by years of carrying heavy law books and working odd jobs to pay for them, clamped down on her brittle bone. We went down together, crashing into the tiered wedding cake. $5,000 of vanilla bean sponge and gold leaf collapsed over us like a sugary tomb. The smell of buttercream was nauseating. I felt the knife skip across my forearm, a hot, stinging line of red, but I didn't let go. I twisted her arm until the silver blade clattered onto the marble. "Agent Miller," I screamed, hoping she could hear me over the siren. A flash of light showed the agent struggling with one of the tactical men near the buffet. The room was a mosh pit of silk and violence. The elite guests were trampling over each other, their dignity discarded as quickly as their champagne flutes. Suddenly, a heavy hand grabbed my shoulder and yanked me off Eleanor. I braced for a blow, but it was Julian. His face was a mask of cold calculation. He wasn't looking at his mother. He wasn't looking at the chaos. He was looking at the leather folder I'd tucked into my waistband, the document with his 7 Bravo account details. "Give it to me, Elena," he commanded. The strobe light caught the sweat on his forehead. "The men outside, they don't care about the guests. They want the paper trail. If I give them that, they'll let us walk. You, me, and your family." "You're lying," I spat, wiping cake frosting and blood from my eyes. "You'll walk out those doors and leave my parents to the cleanup crew. I know how you Montgomery-Vanes settle debts." Julian's grip tightened, his fingers bruising my skin. "You think you're so much better than us because you're honest? Look at you. You're covered in blood and dirt, fighting in the ruins of a wedding that was bought with stolen money. You're part of this now. There's no going back to being a simple lawyer." "Watch me," I whispered. I didn't use my hands. I used my head. I slammed my forehead into his nose with everything I had. I heard the crunch, the expensive, plastic surgery perfect bridge of his nose snapping like a dry twig. He fell back, howling, as blood sprayed his white tuxedo shirt. I scrambled to my feet, but the strobe lights suddenly stopped. The fire alarm cut out. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the sound of a room realizing it was truly trapped. The emergency lights, low, dim red bulbs, flickered on. At the main entrance, the chains rattled. The doors creaked open just a few inches. A voice boomed from the darkness outside. It wasn't the police. It was a man with a gravelly, cultured accent that sent a shiver down my spine. "Mr. Montgomery-Vane," the voice said. "The window for negotiation is closing. We have the perimeter. Bring us the bride and the briefcase, or we start the audit ourselves." I looked at Julian. He was clutching his face, gasping for air. He looked at me, then at the door. "The briefcase?" I whispered. "What briefcase?" I looked at the wedding gifts table. In the center, disguised as a large decorative box, was a reinforced silver case I hadn't noticed before. Julian hadn't just invited me to a wedding. He had invited me to a handoff. And I was the only person in the room who had the key. Not a physical key, but the biometric bypass his mother had forced me to set up for the security system of their new estate. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This suitability amendment wasn't just a legal trap. It was a biometric capture. By signing it with a digital pen, I would have authorized the transfer of the 7 Bravo assets to the men outside. Without my signature, the money was frozen, and the men outside were losing patience. The red emergency lights turned the ballroom into something out of a horror movie. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the walls. "The briefcase, Julian," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the blood dripping down my arm. "That's what this was all about. You needed my thumbprint on that digital pen to unlock the transfer." Julian didn't deny it. He couldn't. He sat on the floor, his bespoke suit ruined, looking like a broken toy. "They would have killed me, Elena. They already killed my father. You thought he died of a heart attack. He died because he lost 5 million of their money in a single night. So you decided to sell me instead?" I felt a coldness settle over my heart. Every "I love you," every late-night conversation, every plan for the future, it was all just a long con. I was the sacrificial lamb at the altar of his debts. I looked toward the kitchen. I saw my dad peeking through the service window. He saw me. He saw the blood. He started to come out, but I shook my head vigorously. "Stay back. Agent Miller." I called out. She was standing over one of the tactical men she'd managed to subdue. Her face was bruised, but her eyes were sharp. "I have the leverage," I said to her, then louder, to the doors. "I have the biometric bypass. And if anyone comes one step closer, I'll destroy the terminal." The voice from the darkness chuckled. "And how would you do that, Miss Sterling? It's a hardened casing." "I'm a Sterling," I shouted back. "We don't need fancy tools. We just need a little bit of weight and a lot of gravity." I grabbed the silver briefcase. It was heavy, at least 40 pounds. I bolted toward the grand staircase that led to the mezzanine balcony. "Stop her!" Eleanor screamed from the floor. Two of the men in tactical gear moved toward the stairs. Agent Miller fired a warning shot that chipped the marble near their feet, buying me 3 seconds. I hit the stairs, my bare feet slapping against the cold stone. I reached the balcony, 30 feet above the ballroom floor. Below me, the elite were huddled in the corners like cattle. Julian was staring up at me, his face a mask of desperation. "Elena, don't," he yelled. "If you break that case, there's no way to pay them. They'll kill everyone in this room. They're going to kill us anyway." "Julian," I screamed. "They don't leave witnesses for a negotiation like this." I looked at the briefcase. Then I looked at the massive, 5-tier crystal chandelier hanging in the center of the room. It was suspended by a heavy steel cable that ran through a winch system right here on the balcony. I wasn't a structural engineer, but I knew enough about physics. If I dropped the case onto the winch, it would snap the cable. The chandelier, 3,000 pounds of lead glass and steel, would drop right onto the main entrance. It wouldn't just block the doors. It would create a barricade of glass and metal that no one could get through without heavy machinery. "What are you doing?" Julian cried out, his voice cracking. "I'm ending the party," I said. I hoisted the briefcase over my head. My muscles screamed. The cut on my arm throbbed. I saw the men at the bottom of the stairs lunging upward.
"Dad."
"Get them into the locker."
"Now."
I roared. I saw my father grab my mother and brothers and shove them into the kitchen. I saw Agent Miller dive behind a heavy oak table. I swung the briefcase down with everything I had onto the winch assembly. The sound was like a thunderclap. The steel cable didn't just snap. It whipped through the air with a lethal crack. And then the world fell. The sound of the chandelier hitting the floor was the sound of 1,000 diamonds shattering at once. The floor of the ballroom actually groaned under the impact. Dust, plaster, and shards of glass exploded outward, creating a glittering fog that blinded everyone in the room. The main entrance was gone. In its place was a jagged mountain of crystal and twisted metal, blocking the doors and trapping the negotiators outside. The room went silent, save for the tinkle of falling glass and the distant, muffled shouting of the men on the other side of the barricade. I slumped against the balcony railing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was covered in dust, white as a ghost. Down below, the red emergency lights caught the movement of people stirring in the wreckage. Julian was crawling away from the glass, his hands shredded. Eleanor was sitting perfectly still, staring at the ruin of her wedding with a blank, catatonic expression. "Agent Miller?" I coughed, the dust coating my throat. "I'm here," she called out from behind the table. She stood up, shaking glass from her hair. She looked at the mountain of crystal. "That was not in the manual, Sterling." "I'll bill you for the consultation," I wheezed. I looked at the staircase. The 2 men who had been chasing me were buried under a pile of plaster and debris. They were alive, but they weren't going anywhere. I slowly made my way down the stairs. My feet were bleeding now, but I didn't feel it. I walked through the hallowed ballroom of the Montgomery-Vanes, through the wreckage of their lies. I reached Julian. He looked up at me, and for the first time, he saw me. Truly saw me. Not as a trophy, not as a tool, but as a predator he had foolishly brought into his home. "You're insane," he whispered. "You've killed us. When they get through that door." "They aren't getting through, Julian," I said, leaning down so my face was inches from his. "Because while you were busy playing Master of the Universe, my brother Leo was in the back with his phone. He didn't call the police. He knows they're slow." Julian frowned. "Then who did he call?" "The Union," I said, a small, grim smile playing on my lips. "My dad's brothers from the docks. They were already on their way because they heard your mother had moved the trash to the back of the room. And they don't use sirens. They use crowbars." As if on cue, a new sound began to echo from the other side of the walls. It wasn't the sound of tactical precision. It was the roar of heavy diesel engines, the sound of air horns, and the rhythmic, terrifying thud of dozens of boots hitting the pavement. The men in tactical gear outside were suddenly the ones being surrounded. I looked at the family of the Groom chairs, now crushed under a ton of glass. My parents were left standing at my wedding, I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room. And, because they were standing at the back, they were the only ones close enough to the exit to get the word out. Your elitism didn't just insult them, Julian. It defeated you. I turned to Agent Miller. The 7 Bravo documents are in my waistband. The briefcase is destroyed, but the hard drive inside is reinforced. It has every wire transfer, every name, every debt. I looked at Eleanor, who was finally starting to cry, not for her son, but for the loss of her perfect reputation. It's over, I said. But as I turned to find my family, I heard a faint, rhythmic clicking coming from the ruins of the cake. Eleanor wasn't crying. She was laughing. A wet, hysterical sound. You think your union boys can stop them? She gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the barricade. You think a few dock workers are a match for what's behind those doors? The mountain of crystals suddenly shifted. A heavy, metallic thud shook the room. Something was trying to blow the doors. And they didn't care who was standing on the other side. The first explosion wasn't a fireball. It was a pressurized blast of air and white dust that punched through the center of the crystal barricade. Shards of glass that hadn't been pulverized in the fall now became jagged projectiles, whistling through the air. Get down, Agent Miller screamed, diving toward the wreckage of the head table. I didn't have time to find cover. I threw myself behind a heavy mahogany pedestal that had once held a 5-foot floral arrangement. The lilies were crushed beneath me, their funeral scent mixing with the acrid smell of blasting caps. Through the settling dust, I saw them. The men in tactical gear weren't just debt collectors. They moved with a synchronized, lethal grace that spoke of military training. They weren't here to negotiate anymore. They were here to sanitize the scene. Julian, Eleanor shrieked, crawling toward her son. Tell them we have the drive. Julian was curled in a fetal position, his hands over his ears. He was a broken man, a hollow shell of the prince he'd pretended to be. He didn't have the codes. He didn't have the drive. He had nothing left but his ruined name. One of the gunmen, clad in matte black with a faceless visor, stepped over the mound of glass. He scanned the room with a thermal optic. He wasn't looking for the elite guests cowering under the tables. He was looking for the heat signature of the hard drive, which was currently pressed against my ribs. I looked toward the kitchen. The steel door was shut, but I saw the handle jiggle. My dad was trying to come out. Stay back, I mouthed, praying he could see me through the haze. The gunman's visor locked onto my position. He raised his suppressed submachine gun. The red of his laser sight danced across the mahogany pedestal, inching toward my shoulder. Pop, pop. 2 muffled shots sparked off the wood inches from my ear. Sterling, move, Miller yelled. She popped up from her cover, firing her service weapon. The gunman's visor shattered, and he slumped back into the glass. But there were more. 3, 4, maybe 6 of them, pouring through the breach. I scrambled backward, staying low. My bare feet were shredded, leaving a trail of red on the white marble. But I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the weight of the drive. It was the only thing keeping these people alive, and the only thing making them targets. Agent Miller, I hissed as I slid behind the table next to her. The Union, my dad's friends, they're outside, but they can't get through the tactical perimeter. These guys have the high ground. Miller slammed a fresh magazine into her pistol. Her face was streaked with soot. Your Union boys are going to get slaughtered if they just charge in. We need to create a distraction. Something big enough to force these professionals to look away from the doors. I looked around the room. My eyes landed on the gas lines for the decorative flambe stations near the buffet. The Montgomery-Vanes had insisted on live fire, cooking to impress their guests. The gas, I whispered. If we can bleed the lines and trigger the fire suppression system, it'll flood the room with halon gas and create a localized explosion. It'll knock them back and give the guys outside a window. And what about the guests? Miller asked, gesturing to the terrified socialites. The halon will drop the oxygen levels, I said, my lawyer brain calculating the liability even now. But if we do it near the breach, the pressure will vent outward. It's a gamble. It's the only hand we've got, Miller said.
Go.
I'll cover you. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted across the open floor, my white dress a perfect target. Pop, pop, pop. The bullets hissed past me, one grazing my thigh, another tearing through the lace of my train. I dove behind the buffet line, my hands fumbling for the industrial gas valves. I turned them. All of them. The hiss of escaping gas filled the air, a low, serpent-like sound. Julian, I screamed, standing up for a split second. Tell your friends to run. Tell them the building is rigged. Julian looked up, his eyes wide. He saw me holding a silver cigarette lighter, a favor from the wedding tables. The lead gunman leveled his weapon at my chest. He didn't care about the gas. He didn't care about the warning. He wanted the drive. Drop it, Miss Sterling, he said, his voice synthesized and cold. I'm a Sterling, I said, my thumb clicking the flint. We don't drop things. We finish them. I flicked the flame. The world didn't end in a bang. It ended in a roar. The gas ignited with a concussive force that threw me backward into a wall of industrial refrigerators. The fire suppression system triggered instantly, shrieking as it dumped a fog of chemical suppressant into the room. The blast wave acted like a giant piston, blowing outward through the breach in the doors. I heard the screams of the men outside as they were tossed back by the pressure. For a moment, there was only white noise and the smell of ozone. I coughed, my lungs burning. I looked up. The ballroom was a chaotic blur of white fog and flickering orange light. The gunmen were disoriented, clutching their ears, their thermal optics useless in the chemical mist. Then I heard it, the sound of a sledgehammer hitting steel.
Clang, clang, clang.
The side service entrance, the one the tactical team hadn't prioritized, burst open.
It wasn't a tactical team that poured in.
It was a wall of flannel, denim, and raw, working-class fury. My father's friends. Men with names like Big Sal and Tiny, carrying pipe wrenches, heavy-duty flashlights, and the kind of anger that only comes from seeing one of your own stepped on. Find Elena. I heard my father's voice roar above the din. The struggle that followed wasn't a gunfight. It was a brawl. The professionals were caught off guard by the sheer, uncoordinated violence of 60 dockworkers who didn't care about rules of engagement. I saw Sal tackle a man in a $5,000 tactical suit, pinning him to the floor with a forearm like a Christmas ham. I saw Miller using the chaos to systematically disarm the remaining shooters. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out. I slumped against the refrigerator, clutching the drive to my chest. A pair of work boots appeared in my blurred vision. Rough, scarred leather. Hey, Peanut, a voice said. I looked up. My dad was kneeling in front of me. His face was covered in soot, and his best suit was torn at the shoulder, but he looked like a king. He reached out, his hand trembling as he wiped a smudge of ash from my forehead. You okay? He asked, his voice cracking. I canceled the wedding, Dad, I whispered, a hysterical sob escaping my throat. I think we lost the deposit. He laughed, a deep, ragged sound, and pulled me into his arms. I sobbed into his shoulder, the lace of my dress finally turning red and gray and black. Best money I never spent, he said. But the moment was broken by a sharp, metallic click. I froze. My dad froze. We looked toward the center of the room. Eleanor Montgomery-Vane was standing in the middle of the wreckage. She had found Agent Miller's dropped backup weapon. She wasn't pointing it at the dockworkers. She wasn't pointing it at the agents. She was pointing it at my mother, who had just stepped out of the kitchen locker, thinking it was safe. You took my world, Eleanor hissed, her voice a jagged ghost of its former self. You and your dock rats. You think you can just walk away with our name? With our future? Her finger tightened on the trigger. Eleanor, don't. Julian yelled, finally finding his voice. He tried to stand, but he stumbled on the glass. I looked at the drive in my hand. I looked at the woman who had tried to buy my soul and settle her debts with my life. You want the future, Eleanor? I stood up, pushing away from my father. I held the drive out in the palm of my hand. Here it is. It's all here. The Macau transfers. The offshore shells. the names of the men outside. I started walking toward her. One shot, and this drive hits the floor, I said, my voice steady and cold. And I promise you, with the gas in the air and the sparks on the floor, the static discharge will wipe it clean. You'll have nothing. No leverage. No deal. Just a murder charge in front of 100 witnesses. Eleanor's hand shook. The mask was completely gone now. She was just a scared, greedy woman holding a piece of cold steel. Give it to me, she pleaded. I can fix this. I can hire the best lawyers. I am the best lawyer you know, Eleanor, I said, stopping 3 feet from her. And I'm telling you, you're done. I reached out and gently took the gun from her hand. She didn't fight me. She let it go, her spirit finally breaking as the first sirens, real police sirens this time, began to wail in the distance. I turned to my mother. She was shaking, but she was alive. I walked over and hugged her, the drive still clutched in my hand like a holy relic. Is it over? She whispered. No, I said, looking at the ruin of the ballroom. It's just starting. The next 6 months were a blur of fluorescent lights, mahogany conference tables, and the cold, sterile smell of courtrooms. I wasn't the gutter-born bride anymore. In the press, I was the whistleblower in white. Julian and Eleanor didn't go down quietly. They used every cent of their remaining clean assets to hire a legal team that looked like a small army. They tried to paint me as a gold digger who had staged the entire attack to extort the family. They tried to say the drive was tampered with. But they forgot one thing. I had been their suitable project for 18 months. I had been at their dinners. I had listened to their business calls while I picked out flower arrangements. I had kept a diary, not of my love for Julian, but of the inconsistencies in his stories. I was sitting in a deposition room, across from Julian. He looked different. The tan was gone. The bespoke suits were replaced by a cheap, off-the-rack navy number his lawyers had told him would make him look sympathetic. Miss Sterling, his lawyer said, leaning forward, isn't it true that you only sought out Mr. Montgomery-Vane because of his family standing? I looked at Julian. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I sought out a man I thought was kind, I said clearly. I found a man who is a ledger. And unfortunately for him, I'm very good at math. I pulled a stack of papers from my briefcase, the real briefcase, the one I'd filled with evidence over the last half year. Let's talk about the suitability amendment again, I said. Because my team has found the original digital draft. The one Eleanor edited 3 nights before the wedding. The one that added a clause about my parents' voluntary relocation to a facility in Eastern Europe. Julian's lawyer went pale. Julian finally looked up. Relocation, he whispered. Mother said it was a retirement home in Florida. She lied to you too, Julian, I said, leaning over the table. She was going to ship them off to a wellness retreat that was actually a private holding facility. She wasn't just trying to hide them. She was trying to use them as collateral for the Macau group. The room went silent. Julian looked at his lawyer, then at the camera recording the deposition. She told me they would be happy, he stammered. She told you whatever you needed to hear, so you'd keep playing your part, I said. You weren't a groom, Julian. You were a distraction. That was the moment the Montgomery-Vane defense collapsed. Not from my evidence, but from the realization that they had been betraying each other as much as they had been betraying me. Julian turned state's witness that afternoon. He gave them everything. The accounts, the names, the locations of the men in the tactical gear. He did it to save himself, of course. He was a Montgomery-Vane to the end. But as he was being led out of the room in handcuffs, he stopped. Elena, he said. I didn't look up from my notes. I really did love the way you looked in that dress, he said. The dress was a lie, Julian, I said, finally looking at him. But the woman wearing it? She's the most real thing you ever lost. The final sentencing for Eleanor Montgomery-Vane was held on a gray Tuesday in November. She was sentenced to 15 years for racketeering, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. Julian got 5, with a chance at parole in 3, thanks to his cooperation. The Montgomery-Vane estate was seized. The ballroom where I almost died was sold to a nonprofit. They turned it into a community center. They tore down the gold leaf molding and replaced the marble with durable, recycled wood. I stood in that room one last time, a week before the grand opening. It didn't smell like lilies or buttercream anymore. It smelled like fresh paint and sawdust. It smelled like work. My father was there, helping the new owners install the handicap ramps. He still had his bad hip, but he moved with a lightness I hadn't seen in years. The insurance scandal Eleanor had threatened him with? It turned out to be another lie. His pension was safe. "Hey, counselor," he called out, wiping his hands on a rag. "You coming to the ribbon cutting?" "Wouldn't miss it, Dad," I said. I looked at the spot where the chandelier had fallen. You could still see a faint scar in the floor, a jagged line where the crystal had bitten into the stone. They hadn't covered it up. They'd polished it. A reminder, the manager had told me, that even the heaviest things can be broken if you hit them at the right angle. I walked out of the building and into the crisp autumn air. My car was a modest sedan, paid for with my own salary. On the passenger seat was a folder for a new case, a class action suit against a predatory lending firm. I wasn't a whistleblower in white anymore. I was just Elena Sterling, attorney at law. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone to give me a seat. I was building my own. I'm sitting on my parents' porch now, the same one I used to run away from because I thought I needed something bigger, something better. My brothers are arguing over a football game in the yard. My mom is inside, humming a song while she makes the same pot roast that's been our Sunday tradition since I was 5. The world thinks my story is about a wedding from hell. They think it's a thriller, a tale of spies and high-stakes finance. But as I watch my dad sit down in his favorite weathered chair, I know the truth. The story wasn't about the Montgomery-Vanes. It wasn't about the money or the drive or the explosions. It was about the silence. For a long time, I let the world tell me that my parents' silence was a sign of weakness. I let myself believe that because they didn't have the right words or the right clothes, they didn't have a voice. I was wrong. My parents were left standing at my wedding because they were the foundation. And you don't build a foundation out of silk. You build it out of stone. They stood so I could find the strength to speak. If there's a lesson in the wreckage of that ballroom, it's this. Never let anyone make you feel ashamed of where you came from. Your history isn't a status to be managed. It's the armor you wear into the fight. People will try to seat you at the back of the room. They'll try to put you in the dark where you're useful but not visible. They'll offer you gold pens to sign away the people who love you. Don't sign. Grab the mic, break the glass.
Turn on the lights.
Because the only thing more powerful than a lie told in a palace is the truth told by someone who isn't afraid to lose the crown. I never got my fairy tale ending. I got something much better. I got my name back. And it's a name that means I don't ever have to stand at the back again. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you've lived through something similar, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.